What is it about vampires that keeps us coming back for more? The eternal life, the forbidden allure, or maybe it's the centuries-old blood foins mixed with modern romance. Whatever it is, there's just something irresistible about a good vampire story. So hello my fellow fantasy book lovers and welcome back to my channel, or if you're new here, hi and welcome. My name is Kathy and I'm a fantasy book lover from Belgium, and no, I don't usually dress up all of this way for videos, and I'm actually going to take off the headpiece before it falls. Yes, I made this myself. Yes, I'm actually a fantasy photographer too, and I love this spooky shit, so I'm gonna put this behind me just for safety reasons. This video is going to be your ultimate guide to vampire books, both old and new. From dark and tragic tales to romance and thrilling stories. I've put together a list that covers every corner of vampire fiction. So if you're ready, let's jump into the night together. To start things off, we have to pay homage to where it all began. The classics that laid the foundation for everything we know about vampires today. Vampires and myths about them are as old as time, but to draw a line somewhere, I'm actually starting with the first English novels written about vampires. Before this, of course, the myths about vampires had already been going around. They were known as strigoi in some languages, and there is, of course, a lot of lore about them to be found online. And a lot of people assume that Dracula is the first vampire book out there, but that's actually wrong. Dracula was inspired by three other tales. The most known is Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu, but there's two other ones that predate it. One of the first written vampire novels is actually The Vampyre by Polidori. It was written in 1819 and is around 200 pages long. This is a gothic, dark story about an aristocratic friend who preys on high society. Years later, there was also the penny dreadful Varney the Vampire. This is actually a collection of short stories that make up a big story, but there is a lot of confusion about the story because there are some inconsistencies in it. Some say that Varney is simply a human who wants to get the money from the rest of his family and therefore kills them, and others say that Varney the Vampire is indeed a vampire who kills them for blood. I haven't read either of these at the moment of recording this video. The oldest vampire book that I've personally read is Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu, dating back to 1872 for only 108 pages. In Carmilla, we follow a young woman that is being preyed on by Carmilla the Vampire. And this book is not only one of the first vampire novels, but it is also one of the first queer romance books ever written. The two girls in the book are actually having a romantic relationship with each other, which is a theme that I found very surprising for a book from this age. The writing is a little bit difficult to get into. It was definitely not as fast of a read as my other books were. And then of course we have the iconic Dracula by Bram Stoker. And fun fact, at the moment of recording this video, I think 2 days ago, they actually found out that Bram Stoker has written another short story which is from the same time period about a hill. I cannot remember the name exactly right now. I will put it here on screen. Which would actually be part of the Dracula story and would possibly be connected to it. Bram Stoker's Dracula was released in 1897 and is around 400 pages long. I have read it both in French and in English, and this is really a darker story with these dark thriller vibes. Now, of course, we know Dracula is a vampire from the start, but we follow this character Jonathan, who doesn't know this, and goes to Count Dracula to let him know that he has acquired a building, a mansion, I think, in England. So he travels to Transylvania to let him know. There is correspondence in this book, there is travels in this book, and Jonathan discovers that Dracula is a vampire, and then he flees from the castle. Jonathan then travels back to Whitby and finds Abraham Lincoln, the vampire hunter, to go and kill Dracula. This book has inspired the majority, I think, of all of the other books that we are going to be talking about today. And the book Dracula inspired a lot of other people's novels about vampires, but also movies. One of the first vampire movies is of course Nosferatu. If you haven't seen this yet and you're into old black and white movies with like the sound effects from back in the days, it is well worth a watch. The movie was actually made in 1922. It is called Nosferatu, and the main character, Count Orlok, really has this creepy, this evil, this horrific interpretation of what people back in the time thought vampires should look like. And then of course we have the classic gothic movies with Bela Lugosi, which were released later with the Dracula appearance, as to this day we can still find it. So if you go into a costume shop and you see a typical Dracula cosplay, know that this is based upon this movie from 1931. And then of course there was another Dracula movie made, which is the movie that I first saw with Christopher Lee, but this one was released years later in 1958. And this is the movie that for me was one of the first ones that I saw with vampires in it, and it quickly escalated my love for vampires. Now there is one final series that I want to include into the vampire classics, and it is Anne Rice's The Vampire Chronicles. This was released almost 100 years after the others in 1976, but I feel that thanks to Anne Rice we have inspired the whole other generation of vampire authors that came after her. The first book from this series is of course the famous Interview with a Vampire, and from this book came the movie Interview with a Vampire in 1994 with Tom Cruise, Brad Pitt and Kirsten Dunst. After this also came a series that I to this day have not seen, and I don't know why. It is a series also called Interview with the Vampire, and it was released in 2022, so about 2 years ago. But of course there were other books from this series that have also been released into movie form. The second book is called The Vampire Lestat, and the third one is Queen of the Damned. And if you would combine those two books, you actually get the premises of the movie Queen of the Damned, which is an icon in the gossip culture. And for me, it really formed me when I was younger. I discovered so much music through that movie, but also I discovered the more romanticized side and the sexual side of vampires that previously wasn't really there. Before Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire, vampires were seen as something that preys on humans, that is just a killer, something evil, something bad. And with Anne Rice's influence on the vampire lore, they humanized it. They also sexualized it, unfortunately. However, for me that's a good thing because it led to all of the other vampire books being written. So if we look nowadays how vampires are generally portrayed in books and series, it is heavily romanticized. They are seductive yet dangerous, but they have feelings and they have a more human side instead of just this beastly side to them. And now I want to shortly talk about different types of modern vampire books, and I'm gonna be splitting this up in a few categories, and you can find timestamps in the description box of this video. So first things first, let's get into modern vampires that actually are very close to the origin. The vampires in these books either are directly influenced from source material or they have a darker, more horrific take on vampires. And I want to start with two books that I personally haven't read but that keep getting recommended to me, so I feel I need to recommend them to you as well. The first one is Salem's Lot by Stephen King. Stephen King is a horror thriller writer, so I feel this is very much a darker take on the vampires. Then of course we have Kim Newman, who is related to Bram Stoker's Anno Dracula, which follows up on the original Dracula story with apparently source material from Bram Stoker but then reworked. And then a horror-based vampire book that I personally didn't enjoy, but if you are more into the horror genre, you might really love this. It is the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires. This book was very dark, was very gruesome, was very horrific in psychological ways, but also like in the imagery that was used. So if you are into gore, into aggressiveness, into psychological horror and thriller, I think you might really enjoy this book. If you're more into lighter fantasy, or if you just want vampires in your books, I don't think this might be for you. I personally didn't really enjoy it, but you might. Other books that are very close to the source material are the Poppy Z Brite books. There is, of course, the iconic Lost Souls, in which we follow a young person who is actually trying to run away from their home. They encounter vampires and they get involved with a group of vampires. This person is very, very young, I think 15 or 16, as they run away from home and get involved. There is a lot of gory details in the Poppy Z Brite books. There is a slight romanticization, but also still keeping the horrific side of vampires in the stories. And if you enjoy these types of stories, there's also the Love in Vain collections. These are all short stories based upon vampires. But do be warned, these were written in the 90s. They are very gruesome and there are no trigger warnings. If nowadays these books would get released, there would be a big page of trigger warnings at the front. So I just want to fully clarify this before you get into these books. These are very gruesome. And then of course we have An Education in Malice by S.T. Gibson. This is a modern Carmilla retelling, sort of. This is not an exact Carmilla retelling, this is heavily influenced by Carmilla. Laura, Sheridan and Carmilla are of course still the main characters in this book, but it is written completely differently in a totally different world building, world setting. It is more contemporary, and I find that this book is a lot more accessible than the original Carmilla, because Carmilla is written in Old English. It is rather slow-paced, whereas An Education in Malice is written a lot more fluently in contemporary English. And then finally within this category we have A Dowry of Blood by S.T. Gibson. This book is written from the perspective of one of the first brides of Dracula, and fun fact, the name Dracula is never mentioned in this book, however we all know it talks about him. In this book we have a very poetic setting. It is written in a very soft way. However, this book is really the processing of trauma, so be warned when you start reading it that it maybe isn't the easiest read, but I found it beautiful. The way it was told, the way it was portrayed, the way that the relationships of Dracula with the brides were portrayed, I personally really enjoyed it. So if you liked Dracula but you want to know more about the brides and their take on everything, then I think this is a perfect book for you. And now we get into my personal favorite category of vampire books. It is the Romantasy books. This category has a lot of books, so I'm going to try and keep it short for every single one of them, but of course I will be linking to every single book that I mentioned in the description box of the video. One of the first Romantasy series that I personally read with vampires in it was the Anita Blake Vampire Hunter series by Laurell K. Hamilton. We follow Anita Blake, a vampire hunter who is hunting vampires where she lives. This takes place in the United States. I don't recall the exact city, but it could be New Orleans. She hunts vampires, she encounters vampires, she gets romantically involved with both a vampire, a werewolf. I don't know the rest of it because I stopped after 8 or 9 books, but this is a very big series. The main character is a female main character, a strong, badass female main character, so you might really like this. After that, there's of course Charlene Harris's The Southern Vampire Mysteries, or the way we all know it, True Blood. This of course has also been released as a series on TV years and years ago. I used to be obsessed with it, but the book series actually is a lot longer and a lot better apparently than the TV series. And this is again a romanticized take on vampires, and in this series the female main character actually gets involved with vampires. However, she doesn't really want to. She's just trying to navigate the world and stand up for herself. Up next we have a totally different type of series. This is by J.R. Ward and it is the Black Dagger Brotherhood series. The first book is called Dark Lover, and in this series we follow all of these alpha male vampire characters. They're all very tall, very broad, physically maybe a copy-paste of each other, with names like Fury and Zadist. takes on their emotions. We know that they are these kind of evil characters. However, they get involved with female vampires that are more fragile creatures. These books are very smut heavy. I personally didn't enjoy it because the male characters are overly alpha male, and I don't enjoy that, but maybe it is something that you do enjoy. They are very protective. They really take things into charge. I do want to let you know that at the beginning of book 1, the female main character gets sexually assaulted, not by one of the main characters from the book, but do note that that happens. Up next, I want to mention Carissa Broadbent's Crowns of Nyaxia series. This is a series that for now has 4 books that are released and 2 others that have been announced and that are currently being written and going to be released. And I feel like the current order of reading the books is first you will read Serpent and the Wings of Night, then you read Six Scorched Roses, after that there is Ashes and the Starcursed King, and if, like me, you cannot get enough of everything, there is also Slaying the Vampire Conqueror. I could be mistaken on the order of reading, but this is how I've read them and it makes the most sense to me. In Serpent and the Wings of Night, we follow our female main character who's the daughter of the current Vampire King, and there are 3 different vampire races or types that are coexisting, and only one of them can reign. So she is entered into this trial, this Hunger Games type situation, and the winner of this contest actually wins a wish granted by Nyaxia, who is like the goddess of these vampires. In Six Scorched Roses, we follow 2 completely different characters than in Serpent and the Wings of Night, but they come into the story in the 3rd book, which is called Ashes and the Starcursed King. Now, you don't have to read Six Scorched Roses, however, I found it a beautiful book. We follow a girl called Lilith. She lives in this town that has been cursed, and she's trying to find a cure for said curse. To find that cure, she's trying lots of things, and she wants to try and see if vampire blood makes a difference. And of course, there is one vampire living in their proximity, so she goes to him and she offers him 6 roses in exchange for 6 vials of blood. And of course, in Ashes and the Starcursed King, everything from the other 2 books comes together and continues on. I'm not gonna delve too much into depth into this book because that would be spoiling the other 2. And in the 4th book, Slaying the Vampire Conqueror, we follow this girl who is a witch-type assassin, is the best way to describe her. And the moment that the book starts, she's actually on an assassination quest, and she feels a wave come into their land, and it's actually this vampire conqueror. The moment itself, she tries to assassinate them, but she's called back by her coven, and afterwards they do decide that she needs to go assassinate him. And she actually needs to infiltrate his ranks in order to do so. I found all 4 books extremely well written. There is a heavy romance line, but there is also politics, intrigue, and a lot more going on. So I would highly recommend these. Up next is a very recent read. It is called Fang Fiction by Kate Stamen London. In this book, we follow our main character who is obsessed with a book about vampires called Blood Void, and she actually ends up meeting someone who resembles one of the characters and might actually be a vampire. So this is perfect for if you want a romance story about vampires and actually being able to imagine yourself encountering vampires. I love this book. It's not as deep or dark as some of the others. It has a beautiful romance line, and I feel this is an urban fantasy, low fantasy, romantasy book. If you want pure vampire smut in a why choose romance, which is a reverse harem, so 1 girl and I think 3 or 4 men at the end, then you should read Court of the Vampire Queen by Katie Roberts. Don't expect much from any of the storyline except the smut. You don't even know the names of the characters before the smut happens, so it's very, very smut heavy, but some of you might enjoy that. Up next, we have a book that could be a YA series, but I feel is more a romantasy series, and it is The Scarlet Veil by Shelby Mahurin. In this book, we follow our female main character who is part of a group called Les Chasseurs, so the hunters, and they hunt paranormal creatures. However, in their group there's also witches, etc. So they hunt evil creatures. At the start of the book, something happens and our female main character actually encounters a vampire and is kidnapped by them. This happens really early on in the book, and everything that happens afterwards was so well written, and you really feel that these vampires are very well fleshed out. There is a heavy romance line in the book, but I'm not going to talk about who it involves. I personally really enjoyed this, and there's a book 2 coming out very soon as well. If you love telenovelas, if you love drama, then Filthy Rich Vampire is the book series for you. This is written by Geneva Lee, and in this series we follow an ancient vampire who awakes from his slumber. He's of course tall and attractive and very rich, and he needs to marry someone, and his mother is actually setting him up to form an alliance with the Witches' Coven, so he needs to marry a witch, but he doesn't want to. So at that event he actually starts dating the human girl who's playing music at that event, and it actually goes from there. So you have this poor human and then this very rich vampire, and he takes her on all these luxury trips, gives her clothing, etc. So if you like being spoiled by a vampire and imagining the way your life could take a turn like that, you might really enjoy this series, but do know it is overly dramatic, very high highs, but also very low lows. Book 1 ends on a very low low, and there is 4 books in this series to conclude it. One of the more recent vampire romances that were a big success worldwide was Brite by Ailey Hazelwood. Ailey Hazelwood is already a well-established romance author, and with writing Brite, she really enters into the realm of vampires as well. In this book we follow our female main character, who is a vampire sent out to live with humans by her father as collateral. Collateral basically means that there is a truce between vampires and humans as long as the collateral is on each side. So a human goes live with the vampires and a vampire goes live with the humans in exchange. At the beginning of the book we know that the character has been collateral with the humans for a very long time. The initial period is over, so she's been recalled, and now she's going to have to marry one of the alphas of the werewolf clan in order to make an alliance with them. And that is what this story is about this vampire girl and this werewolf man getting married basically at the start of the book, and then how that proceeds. This book does have a very specific kink, which is the knotting kink. Maybe look it up before you decide if you want to read this book or not. And again, this is a romance book with smut. Staying in the romance books with smut, we have King of Battle and Blood by Scarlett St. Clair. This is a book series that will have at least 3 books. So the first one is King of Battle and Blood, the second one is Queen of Myth and Monster, and there is a 3rd book coming out pretty soon. And this is part of the Adrian x Isolde series. Isolde is the princess of a kingdom, and Adrian is the king of different kingdoms surrounding them. And to form an alliance, he decides that he wants to marry her for that alliance. And that is the basic premises for this very smutty vampire romance read. And then the last book, I'm not going to go into detail because I personally didn't enjoy it all that much, and I only read the first book. It is From Blood and Ash by Jennifer L. Armentrout. I know there's a lot of people who love this series. It personally didn't work for me, but maybe this is something that you would like, so I've included it in the list so you can look it up. Up next we get into epic fantasy with vampires, and I found this category more difficult than I anticipated, and the main reason I have this category are my all-time favorite books. They are Empire of the Vampire and Empire of the Damned by J. Kristoff. And yes, there is a 3rd book that will be the conclusion of this trilogy coming hopefully soon. In Empire of the Vampire we follow Gabriel de Leon, and Gabriel de Leon is the last surviving Silver Saint, telling his life's story because he's been captured by a vampire. Now in these books there is a lot of epic world building, big battles. Because we have jumping timelines, we also can move rather quickly through the story. And in the 2nd book we actually add a 2nd narrator, which is something I didn't see coming and actually really helped with the pace of the book and where we're going now. And in these books there's a lot of gory battles. The vampires are actually evil. The Silver Saints, which is the order that Gabriel is part of, are actually the the offspring of vampires and humans that have some vampire traits, but they do not want to drink blood like the vampires do. So they actually want to slay all of the vampires. There's other paranormal creatures such as shifters in these series. There's really epic battles. There is some romance and there is some smut here and there, but it's a very small part of the book. And if you like sarcasm and dark humor, I think you will love this. And have I mentioned that these are my favorite vampire books that I've read so far? Up next, we're going into YA fantasy with vampires. Some of these series I remember reading when I was younger, but I do want to include these because not everyone wants a romantasy or wants a heavy vampire read. The first one that I want to mention is Darren Shawn's Cirque du Freak. This is a series of a young boy going into a circus with, of course, vampires. Up next is the very infamous Twilight series by Stephanie Meyer. I do have to mention this series because it made such a big difference into the nowadays culture that sees vampires the way they are. And you may or you may not like sparkly vampires. The books were actually pretty decent. The movies we're not gonna talk about. Fun fact, I actually went to the first movie and left after 15 to 20 minutes and asked for a refund on my ticket. I had read the books, I had loved the books, and the movie was atrocious, in my personal opinion. If you like the movies, that's totally up to you. The soundtrack was on point though. Then of course there is the Vampire Academy series by Richelle Mead. Recently I've also read The Revenant Games by Margie Fustan, in which we have a vampire part and a witches part with humans in the middle, and once every year there are the Revenant Games in which the humans get a chance to either get eternal life from the vampires or bring someone back from the dead at the witches. The humans need to go and capture a vampire, deliver them to the witches, or the other way around, capture a witch and deliver them to the vampires to claim their prize. Another YA vampire book that I really enjoyed was A Tempest of Tea. The best way to describe this series is if you take 6 of Crows and you mix vampires with it. It's this band of misfits that are trying to take over a vampire compound in their city to find specific documents that can save them. This was a very well-written book. I'm not sure if there's going to be a part 2 or if the series continues, but I found it very cleverly written, and for a YA book this had a lot of plot in it and it was just a really easy, fun read. To end the YA book recommendations, there's of course The Witch and the Vampire, in which we follow a girl trapped by her mother who is a witch that has been turned into a vampire, so she has both powers to take into account and to get used to. She tries to escape from captivity, and while doing so she encounters of course one of the witches that was previously in their life, and together they try and find out what is going on. But in this world building there has been constant battles and a war going on between witches and vampires, so it's not as easy as it seems. This was a quick and easy, fast-paced read. I personally really enjoyed it. It does have some romance, but there's no smut in these books. And then finally, to end this very big list of vampire books, there's the other category. These are books that maybe could be romantasy or could be something else, but I felt they deserved their own category, which also could have been called like comedy vampires. The first book that I want to mention is My Roommate is a Vampire by Jenna Levine. In this book we follow a young girl who moves in with this very old vampire who decides to rent out a room of his apartment because he needs some additional income or he just wants to be less lonely. This is a slow burn romance, and at the very end of the book something happens, but what I found about this book is that instead of the vampire being this powerful, seductive male, it's actually the complete opposite. He's very stressed out, he has anxiety attacks, etc. He is not the way that we usually portray vampires. And same goes for the last book on this list. If you want your not so typical vampires, it is Stake Around and Find Out by Evie Belknap. In this book we follow a girl who wants to be turned into a vampire, but somehow hasn't found a vampire yet to do so. So the logical choice is to join a group of vampire hunters. And of course, while being part of this group of vampire hunters, she starts encountering vampires, and they're maybe not entirely what she thought they would be. This book is packed with humor. It is so funny, so well written. It also has a lot of pop culture references to series and movies with vampires in them. It also has found family. There is no smut in this. There is romance, but it's like a family type of romance and not a romantic involvement in relationships type of romance. And that's it. That was the last book on my ultimate list of vampire books that I've read so far. Whether you're into dark gothic classics like Dracula and Carmilla, or the more romantic and action-packed modern-day vampire stories, there's truly something for everyone. Vampires have evolved so much over time, but they've never lost their magnetic pull. And of course, I'd love to know, what is your favorite vampire book and was it mentioned in this video? And have you read any of the ones I mentioned? I'd love to know. Feel free to let me know in a comment down below. And of course, if you enjoyed this video and you want to see me ramble about books even more, give this video a big thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel. I make new videos every week and I would love to have you for every single one of them. And of course, all of the books that I've mentioned are listed in the description box of this video. Thank you so much for watching and I'll see you very soon with a new video. Bye!